Thank you to everyone joining us today. I am Casey Ayers, and this is Inside PMP, what you need to know to ace the exam. So I am a PMP myself. I also have an MBA from the Crummer School of Business at Rollins College down near Orlando, Florida. Most of the time, I'm a strategic consultant for a variety of different companies in different industries, mostly related to project management and development sort of issues. And I am also an author for Pluralsight, most recently of our series on PMP and project management. So in today's webinar, we're going to discuss three key topics. First, we'll take a look at the PMP and share some of the key information that you need to know about the exam. Then we'll look at the exam content in some greater detail and look at what the Project Management Institute says you can expect to see on the exam. Finally, we'll look inside the PMBOK guide, or the Project Management Body of Knowledge, which is really the foundation for the PMP exam and for a lot of other topics related to PMI and project management in general. So first, let's look at that PMP key information. Now, PMP is considered to be one of the most important and widely recognized certifications for project managers today. It's issued exclusively by the Project Management Institute, unlike some other sorts of certifications or things that you can earn that might be issued by several different sources. What that means is that to earn a PMP, you have to complete the exact same type of requirements everyone else who's earned a PMP has. The standard won't vary. So those requirements are all set, and that really helps to raise the value of this certification. It's developed by project managers for project managers. The PMP is developed by the Project Management Institute, which was founded a few decades ago by project managers and is considered one of the leading sources on project management. And it's meant to cover the sort of information that you need to know to be successful in project management, regardless of the type of industry you work in, really focusing on those broader sort of ideas and principles that can apply to just about any type of project. There are over 655,000 PMPs worldwide in over 104 countries to date, which shows you how popular this certification has become. And it's for good reason. When you look deeper into the stats of what the career benefits for the PMP are, PMP certified project managers earn $10,000 more per year on average than non-certified project managers. That's one of the reasons why it's been voted in multiple occasions as the #1 IT certification by CIO Magazine, the IT Skills and Salary Report, as well as others. In addition to the direct benefits, such as perhaps earning more money or having new career opportunities open to you, there are also expanded networking opportunities here that are possible, both within project management with other project managers who might have their PMP, and with those inside your industry who might be interested in learning more about how you can work together based on your passion for project management. Now, the PMP is an outstanding resume builder. It indicates a high level of project management knowledge and expertise, in large part because of the requirements that you have to meet before you can earn a PMP. It also demonstrates commitment to project management as both a career and a profession. So it's not something that you simply do as part of your work, but rather you have decided that projects are the type of work that you'd like to do. You like that varied kind of atmosphere of always trying to accomplish something new. And you like the idea of there being a defined beginning and end, as well as a unique result, which is really the definition of what separates a project from just the standard work you might see in an organization. Furthermore, having a PMP is often required for different types of project management positions. If you aren't required to have a PMP right at the outset, you'll often see that you have to have it within, say, 12 months of earning that position in the first place. So let's look a little more at some of the details here. I'm going to switch over to my standard slide deck. It looks like we've got some formatting issues going on here. So bear with me just a second while I do that. Share my screen over to you here. Okay, hopefully this is coming in. Lindsay, feel free to stop me if not. So to go over the requirements
it
for—
looks good, Casey, but would you mind putting your Skype line down?
Oh, yes.
Perfect.
There we go.
Thanks.
So to go over the project management experience requirement here, this has to be met by everyone interested in earning their PMP, but the requirements vary depending on your level of education. So if you have a secondary degree, that could be an associate's degree, a high school diploma, or something of this nature, then you need to have 7,500 hours of project management experience in total, as well as 60 total months of project management experience. If you have a 4-year degree or more, that could be a bachelor's degree or its global equivalent, the requirements are a little more lenient. You need 4,500 hours of project management experience, as well as 36 total months. Now, why the difference between months and hours here? Well, it's important depending on how you have accrued this experience. These months and hours are counted differently because there's not an assumption that you're necessarily working full-time, but there's also a requirement that this experience be earned over at least a certain amount of time as well. You can only count up to 40 hours per week of work, so even if you find yourself really pulling long shifts or lots of work in your organization, say you're working 60, 80 hours a week, you can still only count 40 hours per week at a time toward this requirement, and that's because PMI wants to see that you not only have a substantial amount of experience that's been accrued very quickly, but that you've accrued it over a long enough period of time, typically multiple years, where you have been able to see the ups and downs and the ins and outs of different projects throughout the project management lifecycle. Now, you can only count experience that you have accrued during the past 8 years of your work, and only project management experience is applicable. So if you have functional management experience where you've been accomplishing tasks outside of a project for your organization, you can't count those hours. But any time that you've spent either directly in charge of a project or over a portion of a project, if you're working alongside a project manager who might be your superior, could count in this case. Now, in addition to the experience and education requirements, there's also a training requirement that holds true regardless of your educational or experience history. You have to earn at least 35 total hours of formal project management training before taking and submitting your application for the exam. There's no difference in this requirement based on your previous educational history because this education is meant to directly prepare you for the PMP exam and the content that you'll see therein. Now, you can get this training from a variety of different sources. These include PMI registered education providers, company-sponsored programs, training companies, college courses that relate in whole or in part to project management, as well as distance learning. Now, PMI registered education providers is bolded here because it has some additional benefit. Earning credit or training hours through a registered education provider means that this content is certified to align with PMI standards and is certified to help prepare you directly for the PMP exam. If your application were to come under one of the random audits that can apply, you don't have to justify this training. Whereas if you receive your education from other sources, that may very well be valid, but you may need to dig up syllabi or provide a grade report or things like this to help show that you, in fact, did tackle topics directly related to the project management professional exam. So with this information in mind, let's move on to the PMP exam's content. What should you actually expect on the exam once you've met the requirements to sit for it? Well, first of all, the PMP exam consists of 200 total questions. 175 of these are scored, and 25 are unscored. Now, you might be used to perhaps the SAT or another test like that where there is an entire group of questions that's thrown out at the end and unscored. That's not the case here. The unscored questions are simply peppered throughout the exam. They'll probably be used as future questions depending on the responses and the degree of difficulty that it can be gauged as and so on. So you really just want to do your best on all 200 questions because there's no way to know what is scored and unscored throughout. The test is meant to take place over a period of 4 total hours, and there are no scheduled breaks. Now, typically, if you need to stretch your legs, use the restroom, or so on, this is possible, but you'll want to speak with the testing center directly in order to understand their rules. And also, remember that the clock will continue to run from the moment you begin the exam until you've either completed all 200 questions or until 4 hours have elapsed, whichever comes first. The PMP exam is typically computer-based, but it's not adaptive in nature. So if you're used to tests like the GMAT, for example, you might know that some computer tests can get harder or easier based on your responses to questions so far. That's not the case here. All 200 questions will remain the same regardless of how you're performing midstream on the test. Furthermore, unfortunately, I can't tell you what represents either a passing or failing score on the exam because it varies. PMI says they use sound psychometric analysis to get down to what the pass-fail criteria should be. What they mean when they say that is, well, each test is different. And so if the 200 questions that you get on your test are on average a little bit harder than those found on another test, you might not need to get quite as many answers correct. On the other hand, if the test that you're taking is a little bit easier than average, you might need to get a few more right than would otherwise be the case. So really, you just want to do your best here. And the first step toward that is having a good understanding of what you'll actually see on the exam itself. The PMP exam is broken into 5 different areas based on what are known as process groups. These include project initiation, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Let's take a look at each of these in a little more detail. 13% of the test can be expected to cover topics related to project initiation. These include the ability to evaluate a project's feasibility. How likely is it that we can do it? How likely is it we can do it given the constraints we're facing? How likely is it that we can meet our objectives? And how likely are those objectives to actually solve whatever underlying need has led us to start this project? We need to be able to identify and analyze stakeholders as well, understanding their importance and context to the project. We also have to identify the key deliverables that represent project success, as well as what high-level risks, assumptions, and constraints might be in place in order to build our strategy for how we're going to approach the project's objectives. Furthermore, we have to be able to lead the development of a project charter, the founding document on which the project is going to be based, including information at a high level about the objectives, when and how and so on the project should be completed, a list of key stakeholders such as the project sponsor and project manager, and so on. We need to be able to gain charter approval from project sponsors and from other key stakeholders. So we need to make sure that we have buy-in from all of the most important people who are going to provide resources and otherwise approve our project's end result. We need to ensure that our project aligns with our organization's strategy. If we are undertaking a project because we think it helps fill a need for our company, is it really filling that need properly? We need to double-check this continuously throughout the project, but especially during the chartering phase when large changes are most likely to occur to our overall project objectives. Furthermore, we need to be certain that project requirements are commonly understood by all key stakeholders and that no one has any misunderstandings about what it is we're seeking to accomplish. The project planning area constitutes about 24% of the exam. Here, we want to establish specific details describing our project deliverables. We have a broad outline of what we seek to accomplish in the project charter, but during our planning, we can get down into the more specific elements that will allow us to see whether we're succeeding or failing and tell us exactly what we need to accomplish. A big part of that is developing project plans and sub-plans. Now, of course, there is that one big project management plan overall, but there are a wide variety of subsidiary plans that would fall into this area as well, which is why it's so important to the exam. These can include specific plans related to time and cost management, quality management, human resource management, communications or risk or procurement or stakeholder management, requirements and configuration management, and so on. All of these are areas that are potentially touched by the PMP exam and that are discussed in the PMBOK guide. Finally, during planning, we also have to gain approval and buy-in for our plans from key stakeholders. Hopefully, we're already off to a good start in initiating, having everyone on board with the project charter. But once we have more details in place within our plans, it's important to gain approval and listen to important feedback here as well. Project execution represents about 31% of the test's total content. This can include acquiring and managing resources, both material and human in nature, leading and developing our project team that's going to actually accomplish work, and acquiring the right talent to get the work done, ensuring that our work meets the quality standards that are outlined in our plans. We also have to be able to manage the relationships and the flow of project information, making sure that everyone has the information they need and that they're not overwhelmed with information they didn't need, that we can work to keep stakeholders all working together toward accomplishing project objectives. During execution, we also want to implement any approved changes and corrective actions that need to take place. After all, plans rarely stay the same from the very beginning until the end of the project. Instead, as we continue to conduct project work, we learn more. We go back to the drawing board. We see potential areas of opportunity or risk, and we change our plans accordingly. As such, we need to make sure that we implement those changes just as we have in our revised plans. Monitoring and controlling comes next and represents about a quarter of the exam's content. Here we seek to measure our project's performance and to identify and quantify any variances that might be acceptable or unacceptable in our project output. This is easily seen in the case of manufacturing, for example. Let's say that we're making a certain type of widget and we have certain specifications that that widget needs to fall within. It might be density or weight or width or height or another type of attribute like this that can be measured. We need to ensure that it sticks within that allowable level of tolerance and that if we're out of control, if we find that the output is no longer meeting these standards, investigate why and then find ways to bring the process back into control. We need to manage any changes and corrective actions and ensure that the project remains aligned with business objectives, ensuring that our plans are what we are actually executing. We have to verify that deliverables meet our quality standards that were established during the planning process. After all, if we're doing something at a lower level of quality than what we need to see, then that's just going to result in a poorer outcome at the end of the project. During monitoring and controlling, we also seek to monitor and assess project risk, to identify any changes in exposure, probability, or projected impact that might take place. And risks aren't necessarily negative in nature. There are also positive risks, which we more often refer to as opportunities. Risk management is about both. It's about being able to mitigate or combat or address risks when they can arise, but also being able to leverage those opportunities when we see those as well. We should monitor our procurement activities in order to ensure that any third parties remain in compliance with our standards and that we're meeting our end of the bargain as well. Finally, we also seek to evaluate and improve our response plans to any risks that could transpire or any opportunities that could arise in the future. During the closing process group, we seek to gain final acceptance of deliverables from the necessary key stakeholders. This could include our project sponsor, as well as potentially a customer, a group of end users, a client, whether it's internal or external in nature, or more. We also seek to transfer ownership of these deliverables as outlined in project plans. Now, we need to have an idea in mind of what happens when the project is completed. If we're developing a new piece of software, for example, what do we do with it once it's done? Do we hand it off to an internal division? Do we publish it to an app store? What's the end goal here? Third, we need to obtain financial, legal, and administrative closure to the project. This allows us to release our project resources so that they can begin work on other projects. After all this has taken place, it's important to take a moment to be retrospective about the project and see what we can learn. We should prepare a final project report that conveys our performance information, what went right, what went wrong, and what we can learn in the future. By collecting these lessons learned and by archiving project assets, we can place ourselves in a position to learn from our mistakes and to see where we did exceedingly well and hopefully do even better next time, whether it's us doing the work or someone else within our organization who could benefit down the line. Now, in addition to these 5 process groups, there are also a number of different cross-cutting skills that are covered in the PMP exam. These could apply regardless of where you are in the project lifecycle, and they include topics like the PMI Code of Ethics that discusses topics like honesty and integrity, responsibility and respect, that should apply to all of the work that you're doing. Coaching, motivation, conflict resolution, and team building techniques that can be important throughout the entire project, as well as communications and active listening. Now, the reason that these are considered such universal skills is that projects at the end of the day are really about people. It's about managing the relationship between all of the different stakeholders who serve to either benefit from the project or can benefit the project through their input. We need to be able to work together and orchestrate all of these different players and elements the way that a conductor would a symphony. We want to bring them together, and we use these techniques in order to do that. Finally, we also have data gathering and decision making that comes into play here, because without taking a more analytical and objective approach, we'll find ourselves managing situations more poorly than not. Other areas that are important universal skills include knowledge management, where we ensure that the right people have the right information at the right time. Meeting management, where we ensure that we're not wasting anyone's time and that we are accomplishing what must be accomplished within our meetings when we bring stakeholders together. Virtual team management, which is extremely important in today's environment. Oftentimes, project team members might be working around the globe 24 hours a day, and managing that is very different than managing a team in close quarters where you all might share an office. Here, there are different cultural differences and time and geographical differences, as well as pure logistics that can get involved. Understanding the impact that those can have and how to manage them effectively is something that you'll see on the exam too. You'll also see issues related to organizational, operational, and situational awareness. Oftentimes, the right answer for one situation might not be the right answer in another situation. Understanding the context of how a decision is being made and what ramifications it can have is incredibly important to effective management. Finally, some other areas include prioritization and time management, both for yourself and for the project, as well as the ability to manage relationships between stakeholders in the project, and between yourself and those who are either conducting or directly involved with project work somehow. Financial management is very important to ensure that the project remains on track from a financial point of view. As is problem... Sorry, my slide seems to be stuck here.
Casey, do you want to move back to the preloaded slide?
My computer is actually frozen, I think. I'm not able to advance or escape out.
Okay, I can just stop sharing real quick. And go
here we go. I'm going to, I can move back to the preloaded slides, it looks like. So let's do that.
Okay.
That gets us right to the end of these. Yeah, here we go. That gets us right to the end of these techniques anyway, problem solving being the last of these, which can obviously apply throughout the project management lifecycle as well. So now that we have a general idea of what the PMP exam will cover, let's take a closer look at the PMBOK guide, which is the guide that we're really going to use as that foundation for a lot of our studies for the PMP, and also helps to create that foundation for the exam itself. So the most important thing to know about the PMBOK guide is how it's structured. And it's structured around 10 different knowledge areas. These include integration management, scope management, time management, cost management, quality management, human resource, communications, and risk management, as well as procurement and stakeholder management. In addition to these 10 knowledge areas, there are also the 5 process groups that we just spoke about and that help to determine how the exam is broken down. These include initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Now, in the PMBOK guide, you will find 47 different project management processes, and each of these belongs to one of these process groups as well as to one of these different knowledge areas. For example, if we talk about performing quality assurance, that's something that would be found within the project quality management knowledge area, but within the executing process group as well, since it mostly would take place during executing and has to do with quality. Each of these different processes includes inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. For example, if we look at estimating costs, some of the inputs that might be very important to doing that effectively would include the cost management plan, the human resource management plan, given how big of a line item labor often is on a project, the scope baseline, which tells us more about what we are trying to accomplish, the project schedule, which can have some impact on how much it costs to get certain activities done by a certain time, as well as the risk register and other factors. Tools that we might use involve a wide variety of different estimating techniques. And outputs would be the actual estimates that we're trying to arrive at, as well as the basis for those estimates, and updates to other project documents. Now, each of these processes serves as a guide to completing essential project management tasks. They're not meant to be an end-all be-all by any means, but instead to provide a general roadmap of the type of things you might want to think about and the type of tools that might come in handy when accomplishing each of these different types of activities. Let's take a very quick look at all 47 of these different processes just to give you a broad overview of what you can expect to see within the PMBOK guide. The two initiating processes that you're likely to see here are developing the project charter and identifying project stakeholders, both of which tend to take place earliest within the project. Planning processes include developing the project management plan, planning scope management, collecting requirements, defining project scope, and creating the work breakdown structure. In addition to planning schedule management, defining activities, putting them in sequence based on the relationship they might have, any things that have to be required to complete it before others can take place, and so on, estimating activity resources and durations, as well as developing the project schedule. There are even more planning processes to keep in mind too, including planning cost management, estimating project costs, determining the budget for the project overall, and planning quality and human resource and communication management. We also make subsidiary plans for risk management. We need to identify the risks that we might see on a project, and we want to perform some analysis on these risks to understand how big of an impact they might have and how likely they might be to occur. We also need to develop our responses should those risks arise. The last two planning processes are planning procurement management and planning stakeholder management, both of which again feed into our overall plans for the project. Now, planning is definitely the largest of the process groups that we see within the PMBOK guide, but there are a number of executing processes as well. First is directing and managing project work overall, followed by performing quality assurance, acquiring the project team and developing them, helping them to work together and accomplish project goals, and then managing their day-to-day work during project execution. Management of communications and conducting of procurements would also be found here, along with managing stakeholder engagement. Monitoring and controlling processes that can be found in the PMBOK guide include monitoring and controlling project work at a large scale, as well as performing integrated change control. This one's important because all of the different changes that might occur to our plans are sent through a central process of some sort. That way we're not making changes on the fly and without letting people know in some sort of formal capacity. Instead, any changes from the plans that we have laid out should go through this integrated process where they can either be approved or denied or tweaked accordingly. And then plans can be updated with that change so that everyone always remains on the same page. Validating and controlling project scope, where we ensure that we are accomplishing what we set out to accomplish, are also monitoring and controlling processes. Others include controlling schedule, as well as controlling costs, quality, communications, and risks, where we're making sure that we are accomplishing what we want to in each of these areas, not overspending, not going past our schedule limits, hitting the quality requirements that we want to, making sure that our communications are effective and that we have a full idea of the risks that our project face. We also have to control procurements, making sure that our relationship with that procurement source is going according to plan. And we also want to control our stakeholder engagement. Closing processes are pretty simple. There are two of them: closing the project or a project phase, where we move from one phase to another, or we're wrapping up project work as a whole, and closing procurements, where we are ending relationship with a third party that might have helped us on a portion of the project. Now, this is probably very overwhelming because if you're just seeing these 47 processes for the first time, you're probably thinking, oh boy, this test covers a lot of information. How am I going to get ready for this? But the reality is, if you sit back and think about each of these areas for a minute, I'd be willing to bet that you already have experience in most of them right now, even if you don't have a formal process in place. After all, if you've accrued that project management experience, chances are you've probably had to make a budget or help to control a budget. You probably had to help put activities in a certain order for how they should be completed, or make estimates about how long it might take for something to be done. You've probably had to communicate with stakeholders or fulfill some of these other types of requirements. As such, a lot of what you might find in here will be directly referential back to the work that you've already accomplished, whether or not you had a formal process in place in the past. Furthermore, these processes are rarely used in a vacuum. While they might be discussed on an independent basis, they're not actually meant to be used that way. For example, you would often be estimating or developing your budget and your schedule hand in hand because of the direct impact that one can have on the other. Furthermore, you'll almost never use these processes just once, but instead they're something that you can revisit time and again. For example, if we need to make changes to a plan based on the measurements that we're taking in the field on work being done, we'll turn back to that planning process and see how we can revise and improve our plans to better accommodate the goals that we're trying to achieve. Really, all of these different processes are meant to work together in order to help balance constraints and meet project objectives. Regardless of the type of work that you're accomplishing or the type of project you're working on, there are a number of key constraints that will almost always apply. These can include cost and time, schedule and quality, things of this nature. If you are trying to complete something of the highest possible quality, perhaps you reduce the scope a bit and you give yourself more time, more money, and more people in order to make sure you do the best possible work. On the other hand, if you need a solution yesterday, you may place more of your emphasis on getting the job done very quickly, even if quality standards aren't as high. And you might be willing to spend more money because it's so important for it to get done right away, even if it might be more efficient without a time crunch to do it over a longer period of time. Now, when we look at all of these different pieces of information, this leads nicely into our series helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Now, this is recently completed. All these courses are now available at Pluralsight after an introductory course on project management and the PMP exam, where we discuss the basics of the prerequisites, what you need to do before applying, and so on a little more. We jump right into content that tracks nicely with the PMBOK guide and what you would expect to see on the PMP exam. This includes courses on organizational influences and the project management lifecycle, as well as all 10 of those knowledge areas: integration and scope management, time and cost management, quality and human resource management, communications, risks, procurement, and stakeholder management as well. At the end, the final course will help get you through some of those last details you need to know before taking the PMP exam, and will teach you what you need to know about making sure your credential stays up to date for years to come once you've earned it. Now, the even better news is that Pluralsight is a registered education provider with PMI, and as I said earlier, REP training hours do not need to be justified in case of your application being audited. All you need to do once you've taken the courses is to retrieve your certificates from the My Transcript option within your account as they're completed, and you can use these as proof that you have completed the courses successfully. You can use this series to either totally fulfill your training requirement for the exam or just as an additional training tool. If you're taking some classes in real life, for example, and would like to just get another opinion or another viewpoint or a little more information about a certain area, then these courses can hopefully be a solution for that as well. And so that's what I have for you today. Here is my contact information, and I'll be happy to look through some of your questions now. I see that there are some that have already come in. Michael asks if there is any difference in requirements for someone who has an advanced or graduate degree. Unfortunately, the answer is no. The only difference is if you have a 2-year or high school diploma as opposed to a 4-year or higher. So if you have a 4-year or higher, including graduate or post-grad work, you would need the 4,500 hours and 36 months of experience in place before submitting your application. As for a piece of software, to answer Doug's question, is there a piece of software that is available that encompasses the entire process that the PMBOK guide advocates? I don't think so, because there's kind of a difference in what the PMBOK guide says and what software would necessarily do. PMI tries to point out that the PMBOK guide is meant to be seen as a framework, not as a methodology. So you can apply concepts that you would find in the PMBOK guide to Agile project management, for example, or to other types of project management methodologies. It's meant to really fill in some details about processes that would apply to most projects most of the time, regardless of how you go about that work specifically. To answer Raja's question, where can I obtain full-length sample tests to test myself before taking the actual exam? So one good place to start is with the assessments that are attached to each of the different courses in the Pluralsight Learning Path. Overall, there are a couple hundred questions, I believe, in total, spanning all 14 of those. So that would actually get you pretty close to a sample test. However, I also definitely endorse being able to take full-length sample tests before taking the exam. For that, there are a number of online resources, both free and paid, that you can find by searching. And then I would also suggest, if you are able to, check your local library. Oftentimes there will be PMP prep books there that include full tests on paper that you can go ahead and take at your leisure and without having to pay to do so. I really recommend a mix of those kind of book-based tests as well as taking at least one or two practice tests on a computer just so that you get used to having to answer in that format as well. Todd Jones asks, I took a training class for the 35-hour credit last year. How long is that good for? So your training should be good for a 12-month period leading into your application. Now your application is only valid for 90 days once opened, but you can always go back and reopen an application and go ahead and submit it at that point. So your education, your training requirement should still be valid even if you've not yet submitted your application. But I would recommend you go ahead and do so. And then once your application has been approved, you have 12 months from that point during which you can take the exam. As far as Praveen asks, I have 10 years of software development experience and am playing the role of a technical lead. Can I go for PMP? Is there any approval required from the person in the company? So this is an interesting question because his title isn't necessarily project manager, but that doesn't mean that he hasn't been accomplishing project management related tasks. What's important is to have a list of the hours and an idea and description of what it is you've been accomplishing toward a project that involved project-related management taking place. As I said earlier, you don't have to be in charge of the overall project. You can be in charge of just a portion of it. But as long as you have some project management in place, you will be eligible there. The only approval you would need is if your application comes under audit, you do need someone who can vouch for you having completed those hours and those hours being eligible and in line with what you say they are. So that could be a colleague, it could be a client, it could be your supervisor or boss in those situations. There are a variety of different sources you can turn to, but you do want to make sure that there's someone in place that you can verify with should your application come under audit and you need to provide some verification that you do in fact have that experience. Vanessa asks, the PMP exam is changing in January. What do you recommend testers that do not intend to test before that time do in order to prepare for the new PMP? That's a great question, and in fact, this webinar helps get you prepared for either one. The reality is the content of the exam is not drastically changing. It's just being tweaked. The biggest change that's happening is that there's a greater emphasis being placed on stakeholder relationships in the new version of the test. And so understanding the impact that project management can have on the people involved is where the test is going to pick up some more focus moving forward. And so that's something that we definitely have in mind within our PMP series, making sure that it aligns with those new requirements and is kind of future-proof in that regard. But the good news is I think the changes are a little bit overhyped. The exam is actually going to stay fairly similar, but with a greater emphasis on the people side of project management. Robert Short asks, are the questions on the exam multiple choice or interactive questions where you would need to do something? They are all multiple choice in nature. That's a great question. So you're looking for A, B, C, D here, and it's all going to be multiple choice in that regard. We have a question about a viewer having a master's degree from India, working in the U.S. for the past 15 years with total experience of around 25 plus. That should certainly be sufficient. However, it's important that within the past 8 years, you have the either 4,500 or 7,500 hours necessary. In this case, with a master's degree, 4,500 hours should do it. So as long as you have 4,500 hours of experience within the last 8 years, then that would be sufficient. If you mostly had experience more than 8 years ago in project management and don't have much recently, you would need more recent experience. Shashikant asks if there are changes in the PMP PDU requirements beginning in 2016, and there are. Up until this point, it has been possible to count a greater amount of the work that you are actually doing as a project manager toward those continuing education requirements. Moving forward, there will be a greater emphasis on giving back to the profession through creating new project management content, hosting webinars like this one perhaps, or also conducting and engaging in educational opportunities like watching this webinar. So these are all different areas where PDUs can be earned toward that continuing certification, and we cover that in great detail in the course Earning and Retaining Your PMP Certification, which is the last one in the learning path. We spoke about the updated test already a bit. Is the PMBOK guide enough to pass the exam, Fola asks. Is it advisable to utilize additional resources? I think it's absolutely advisable to use additional resources, and that's one reason why the training requirement is in place. The 35 hours should give you a good picture past what you would see in the guide itself. Obviously, the guide is a very important element. I would say it's the most important element in your studying. But in addition to that, you also want to take advantage of education that can give you more real-world examples and scenarios of how to apply this information. You want to be able to take advantage of practice tests as well, which you're not going to find in the PMBOK guide. That'll give you an idea of the kind of questions you might expect to see and so on. So I would use the PMBOK guide as part of a set of resources in preparing for the exam. Robert asks if the PMBOK guide is a standard publication or if there are versions authored by various individuals. There is just one PMBOK guide. It is issued by PMI. You can purchase it in either a print copy, or if you become a member of PMI, then you not only get a discount on the exam, but you also get a free copy of the guide. I normally recommend that you become a member of PMI if you are interested in taking the exam, because the cost to join is lower than the discount that you'll receive on the exam and the value of getting that free copy of the guide as well, if you don't mind a PDF version. Tushar asks, how do I go about filing the PMI application form, as it is very lengthy? I am a BA recently, and in the past played a business analyst and project manager technical role for 5 years. So this is a good point. The application process is lengthy. You need to be able to measure out and justify your different work experience and your different training requirements. So I recommend, as you sit down and begin to figure out whether you meet the training requirements, list those portions of work, not most recent, but that represent the greatest number of hours worked. For example, if you worked on one giant project and you have over 4,500 hours of experience just on that one, you would want to start with that project and then work down to others if necessary below that, because that will allow you to put in less information to the application, and you won't need to verify as many sources of education or of work experience if that comes up, and so on. So start with the biggest pieces, and that can really help to expedite your application process. Let's see here. So Fairley asks, does only project management experience count or generic project management work as well? Having 2 years of project management experience, is that enough if there were several years before as a developer working on projects? I would say the answer to that is yes, so long as you have experience when you were in a development role managing the project at some level. So even if you were not officially titled the project manager, again, as long as you were fulfilling a role, an assistant management role on that project of some sort. Perhaps you were in charge of a particular set of deliverables or a particular area such as cost or schedule or development of a feature on the project, those are all areas that would be considered eligible. Drew asks if you need to be sponsored by your company in order to apply for the PMP, and the answer is no. You are free to be able to pursue this yourself. Your company may offer training, or they may offer some reimbursement for your training, depending on what your benefits might look like, but you certainly don't need their approval in order to earn it or any sort of sponsorship. This is something that you can pursue independently yourself. Xavier asks, he says, I am from India. Is the probability of getting a job in the U.S. high if I complete my PMP? Honestly, I don't know. I can't answer that with great confidence for you because it depends on the body of work that you've accomplished, what your resume looks like, and the sort of skills that you're able to bring to the table. But it certainly can't hurt. PMP will definitely show in a universal and a global sense that will be recognized in the United States and elsewhere that you have substantial experience in project management, that you're committed to it as a discipline, and that you are bringing a formal set of skills and a way to speak about project management in a coherent fashion that would allow you to mix nicely into companies that have a large project management infrastructure. Shalini asks, how long does it take for the application to be approved after you have submitted it? Typically, there will be about 5 days, 5 business days, for a validation process to take place on the application. At that point, you'll be informed by email that your application is either complete or missing some details. And assuming it's complete, you'll be asked to make payment for the exam at that point. Once you've made payment, you'll be informed as to whether your application is audited or if you can go ahead and schedule the exam. If it's going to come under audit, which is totally random, there's nothing that you could do to either trigger that or not trigger that from taking place. A small portion will be audited at random. Then they will provide you details on how to verify your education and work experience. If it's not audited, then you can schedule the exam right then for as early as your local testing center has a date available. Paul asks, are there practice questions available online to get used to get ready for the exam? And again, yes, the questions that are associated with Pluralsight's courses are a good starting point, and there are other sources that you can search for out there as well. Another question is asking if scoring between 80 and 90% in practice tests should be good enough to give good confidence to pass the exam. I would say yes. It depends on the practice exam, of course. If you're working with one that tracks pretty closely to the exam's content, though, that would normally indicate that you have gained enough proficiency to pass the exam, even though the exact benchmark may vary, and I can't tell you an exact passing score. But typically, if you're in the 80 to 90% wheelhouse on your practice questions, that's a good sign. Dustin asks if there are any significant differences between the PMP exam and the CAPM exam. Yes, insofar as the CAPM is less comprehensive. There is not as substantial requirements in place for the CAPM, so it's often used as a stepping stone to help get ready for the PMP. And the CAPM test does not go into as great of detail in terms of a lot of areas the way that the PMP exam will. So that's the main difference. Essentially, if you're prepared for the PMP exam, you're definitely prepared for the CAPM exam. If you've prepared for CAPM, you probably still need to do some more work in order to ensure you'll be ready for the PMP. Doug asks, at the end of the project, does the years of continuous support of the product count toward project management? This really is a question that would be based on the context of your organization. But typically, a project is defined as having a set start and end, even if it takes place over anywhere from weeks to years. But once it's come to the end, there's a unique deliverable or result that's handed off to someone else. So if your role has shifted at that point from developing the project to servicing the end result, then I would say no, that experience would not necessarily count toward the requirement. However, if you're continuing to develop new resources to improve on the project or do things like this that would actually represent the project continuing, then that would be different, and it would indicate perhaps there are some new miniature projects that can be associated with that main project that you started out with. Robert asks, it looks like there are additional certifications that you can continue after the PMP, such as PMI-ACP. Are there good sources that can help with an agile environment and preparing for this certification? So yes, there are a number of different other certifications that are offered, both in terms of agile, like the PMI-ACP, and then also for program and portfolio management. I am not completely familiar with all of the requirements for each of these. They are not as widely held as the PMP is, but that also can mean that they're very valuable within their areas because they represent an even deeper level of specialization and expertise. So I would recommend checking with PMI for resources for each of those, especially because some of these are relatively new in nature and have only been around for a year or two so far. They've added a number of new types of certifications recently. Vanessa asks, does time as a team member or project contributor rather than as a manager on the project count toward hours necessary to qualify to sit for the PMP exam? The answer there would be absolutely, as long as you have some sort of management role within the project. So even if you're just managing a small portion of the overall project's work, then that would count in this case. Michelle asks, what are the recommended prep study hours before taking the exam? The answer there really varies based on you. I would not recommend scheduling your exam for the day after your application is approved. The general timeline that I would recommend is to complete all of your training requirements as necessary for the application, submit your application, and then once it's been approved, give yourself at least a couple weeks after that application's been approved before you sit for the test. And during this time, you can take practice tests. You can work on batches of 50 or 100 or even a full 200 questions for an exam simulation, and use this and grade it and provide yourself with some objective feedback. Figure out areas where you might still be a little rough and need a little more work to be done, and then try and gauge the amount of time you give yourself accordingly. Go back and review those areas where you might be missing a lot of questions. Perhaps you need to learn a little bit more in that area. And then once you feel pretty confident on practice tests, I would think that you'll be ready to go ahead and sit for the real thing. Looking through, I think we've got time for just another question or two here. Craig asks if I can speak to the updated test. To kind of circle back to that, the main difference now is going to be on a renewed and deepened focus on stakeholder management and stakeholder relationships. So at each point during the project, in areas anywhere from cost to quality and communications management, how it is that we're gaining buy-in and sign-off from stakeholders, engaging them, getting them leveraged and utilizing them toward the project's outcomes and so on would all be very important here. And those are areas that the new version of the test should cover in a little bit more detail. So you would just expect to see more flavor toward people management and the management of relationships with others rather than on the purely technical aspects of project management that can take place. Syed asks, how many questions do you need to have correct in order to pass the exam? Syed, I don't know. It'll depend on the particular test that you get, depending on how difficult or easy the questions are in the random batch that consists your exam overall. That number will vary somewhat. But as I answered a little earlier too, if you're in the 80 to 90% range on practice tests, that's normally a good sign that you're prepared for success. And I am, okay, so Michael asks, can you give some insight into documentation format and detail for project management experience? Great question. So one thing that you'll definitely need is information for a contact who can verify this experience. This can be a colleague, a supervisor, a client, or someone who worked alongside you on the project, someone who was there and can certify that you indeed completed work as stated. Furthermore, you need to be able to describe the work that was completed and your role in that work. And you need to be able to break that work estimate of hours down into each of the 5 different areas. How much time did you spend on initiating? How much on planning? How much on executing project work? How much on monitoring and controlling? And how much on closing out the project? Now, you have to have experience in all 5 of these areas for the PMP exam, but it doesn't have to be an equal amount. You could have just an hour or 2 in project initiation or closure, for example, and that would be sufficient so long as you have hours in the other areas. In some projects, maybe you come on relatively late, and so you don't have any initiating hours. That's okay. That still counts, and you can still log any planning or executing or monitoring and controlling hours that might have taken place there. You just want to make sure that you have at least a couple hours in all 5 of the areas across the entire body of experience that you bring to the table. I think that's just about it. The other questions I'm seeing are repeats of other ones at this point. So I really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope you'll check out our further resources at Pluralsight in your journey to prepare for the PMP. And best of luck in undertaking this journey. I think earning a PMP can be a great next step in your career, and is certainly something that you should consider if you've got interest in project management as a profession. Thanks so much.
Casey, thank you so much for presenting today. Any final word beyond that?
Not really. I think that'll do it. Just thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you everyone so much for participating. Thank you for submitting your questions. Again, feel free to continue the conversation online on Twitter. Tag us in your comments with hashtag #PluralsightLive for a chance to win 3 months of training. You can check out Casey's courses. If you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out at webinars@pluralsight.com. And remember, as you leave, please take a moment to fill out our survey. Thank you so much.